Fantastic. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk this morning about Peirce's icon, which I personally see as being quite fundamental to Peirce's construction of meaning and quite fundamental to his construction of the world. Peirce's icon has got an interesting history. I'm going to touch on that right at the beginning. But recently, there's been a paper in 2015 by Donald Hoffman, who talked about the icon as part of an interface theory of perception. Now, you don't need to be familiar with that in terms of what I'm going to say today, but essentially, just to summarize, he argued essentially that human perception operates a bit like a computer desktop. We use icons which are sitting on the desktop, not because they're veridical, not because they're actually representative of reality, but because essentially they're useful. They simplify reality. We don't need to know what's going on behind them, but actually if we use them properly, then we'll actually be successful in the world and the survival of the fittest will be ensured. And he uses in his paper in 2015 a number of kind of computer gaming models to try and show that that's the case. But essentially what he's arguing is that the icon, and he's quite right in this, the icon is actually fundamental to how we understand the world. I'm going to disagree with him in terms of actually how it works, but he's actually right in terms of it's fundamental to how we understand reality and how we understand meaning. Yogi and Brian then wrote a paper in 2024 trying to tie Hoffman's paper more closely into biosemiotics, and I'll touch on that as well. So let us begin just with a quick overview. Yep, quick overview. Is it coming? There we go. A quick overview of the icon. And it flipping well has got a complex history. It's been all over the place, frankly. Early Eco, back in the 1970s, Umberto Eco actually rejected icons as being cultural signs. Similarity is simply a matter of convention. And famously, he argued that we ought to get rid of icons. He did change his position later on, but essentially that's where he began. Sternfeld, in the last sort of 20 years, has resurrected the icon in the form of diagrams, and he sees those as the basis for natural propositions. So he says, icons understood as those signs whose function as signs is due to some sort of similarity between them and their objects, and diagrams as that special sort of icons which represent the internal structure of those objects. So he is seeing iconicity as fundamental to our understanding of the world, and he does it through his concept of diagrams. And then we've got Hoffman, as I mentioned in 2015, saying that icons simplify reality. We see kind of reality through them. For the perceptions of Homo sapiens, space-time is a desktop and physical objects are icons. So there's an interesting history there. I'm going to add another layer onto all of that in a minute. And apologies to do this to you at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. But I'm going to talk about Hegel. And Hegel, I think, is where all of this begins. So Peirce's icon, I would argue, is largely misunderstood. Peirce is working within a 19th century philosophical context. And what you really do need to understand is that in the early years of Peirce's life, and in terms of his early academic career, he was surrounded by Hegelianism. There's a fascinating book by William Grotzman, published, I think, in 1973, that talks about the American Hegelians. He talks a bit about Peirce, but actually what he does is do a great job of demonstrate the environment in which Peirce was kind of growing up intellectually. Peirce rejects Hegel, and if you look at Peirce's comments about Hegel in his writings, he's pretty critical of Hegel, but actually what he's really doing is criticizing Hegel for having an overemphasis on logic. Peirce wants to bring some empiricism into Hegel, and he criticizes Hegel for being too much about knowledge. But essentially, and this is absolutely critical, and I've written the book on this, he adopts Hegel's model of cognition. Now, it is 9 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. We've been here for 2 days. I'm not going to get into huge detail on this, but essentially, Hegel's model of cognition is as follows. We're confronted with being. We don't have sense perceptions in the way that Locke or Hume would talk about sense perceptions. We're confronted with being, and what we do is we pick things out of that continuum. And in doing so, what we do is we posit an essence. It's a guess at reality. And that is a form. It's It's a guess by our mind that something out there exists and that's what it's like. What he then says is that there's a doubling of form. So you've got the form that is actually out there in the world, and there is the form which is actually in our mind. And then there's a struggle, a dialectical struggle between that form and that form. He calls it a doubling of form. And through logic, he argues that these two things will resolve each other and we'll have a notion which becomes a better and better notion of what the world is. And those are our concepts. This whole idea of a struggle between the essence and reality, the doubling of form, is interesting. Donald talked on Monday about the free energy principle, and if I'm right and got the quote right, he talked about it as the probability of a mismatch between model and world. Well, this is what Hegel's saying. There's the probability of a mismatch between model and world, and we need to dialectically resolve those. So this is Hegel's model. I'm utterly convinced that Peirce is really using this model in his understanding of the sign. And what he sees is that the essence is posited as a mediator between the mind and reality. And that idea of mediation is fundamental to understanding where the icon is. So, is the icon the equivalent and thirdness? And the icon, and I'll explain more in the next 2 or 3 charts, is positioned where it is both an object and a first. And that position in his classification is absolutely critical to understanding what the icon is about. Now, a couple of comments just on this classification. The really interesting thing is that he puts the object in the middle. It's actually between the representarmen and the interpretant. If he was John Locke or if he was David Hume, he'd have the object down the other end. He'd have it right on the left-hand side as the sender of the representarmen or the reference behind the representarmen. He puts it in the middle, and he puts it in the middle because essentially it's positioning itself in the same way as Hegel's essence does, as a guess at reality. Now, I was lucky enough in my kind of academic career to spend a lot of time reading philosophy in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. And if you go back that far, you find that the idea of the object is actually seen for most of Western civilization as a mediator. It's only in the 18th century that we get this ridiculous idea that it's out there somewhere in reality. If you read Duns Scotus, if you read Poinsot, if you read Kant, if you read Hegel, if you read Schelling, they're talking about the object as an object of thought. It's a guess at reality. And Lady Welby, who actually obviously kind of is in communication with Peirce, actually goes out of her way in one letter to say, I'm talking about the object as it was used in the 13th century. So what we've got is the icon positioned as an object of thought. It's not a reference, it's an object of thought, which is a guess at reality. So that's the kind of the vertical column. On the horizontal row, we've got the icon as a first, and it's monadic. Now, a first for Peirce means it's a vague, it's indeterminate, it's a guess, it's a quality of feeling. It's not a thing, it's a quality of feeling. So the atmosphere in this room or the atmosphere in the canteen next door is a quality of feeling. It's an abductive guess at what sort of thing it is. And so an icon is a first, which I'll come on to explain in a second. But the really weird thing is it's positioned as a monadic relationship. Now, hold on a minute, isn't similarity meant to be a dyadic relationship between the object and the sign? Why on earth is Peirce saying the icon is monadic? That's the really interesting question, which I'm going to address in the middle, in a minute. So, right, let's take the question of vagueness. Why is Peirce's icon vague? Well, what we've got to do is go back to nominalism. And nominalism starts tragically in England with a guy called William of Ockham, who was born about 20 miles away from where I lived. for most of my life in a little village in Surrey. He died in 1349 of the plague. The world would have been a much better place if he died a lot earlier. Central to the nominalist idea is that we know the identity of our sense data. So when I see a red patch, I might not know whether it's real or not, but I know it's a red patch. And one of the results of that is we get the idea of sense data. We get the idea of sense impressions, which has kind of pervaded philosophy ever since. The other and catastrophic consequence of this idea that we know our sense data is that we start to separate them. So if I have a sense data which is red, I can see a red sense data. If I have a sense data which is green, I can see a sense data that's green. I can't have a sense datum which is red and green at the same time, because the moment I know that one is red and one is green, they separate. And so we end up with an atomized theory of sense perception, which is the fundamental problem in Western philosophy. It's how you get problems with causation, identity, induction. Everything stems from that fundamental mistake that we're separating our sense data. And Hume obviously argues that it all then comes down to constant conjunction. So Peirce overturns all of this. He says, right, forget all that. We're against nominalism. We have direct experience of reality. So for him, there is no Kantian veil of perception. We actually have direct experience of reality. But, he says, we don't see it as atomized sense data. What we do is we see the world through what he calls perceptual judgments. And perceptual judgments spontaneously categorize our perceptions as members of classes. So we don't actually see a red patch. We see a patch which looks a bit like other patches that we've seen before. So it's indeterminate. So it's a vague. Now, this spontaneity is clearly kind of present in this duck and this rabbit. Our mind just instinctively, spontaneously classifies our perceptions as things. And you can play the game of making it a duck or making it a rabbit. It's something that obviously we had kind of from our days in the jungle, when you had to really kind of realize whether a lion was a lion quite quickly. You couldn't stand there and try and work it out. We instinctively categorize things, but in categorizing things, they remain vague. They remain this sort of thing, but they aren't precisely one thing or another. So perceptual judgments are indeterminate, they're vagues, they're guesses at reality. And what I would argue, because of where the icon is positioned in the classification of signs, the icon is an object of thought. It's a perceptual judgment caught up in the sign. So it's part of semiosis, but it's a vague and it's indeterminate. So that's the business of vagueness. Let's now talk about why the icon is monadic. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of papers in the literature about the icon being a similarity between the sign and the object. But Peirce would actually be horrified at that suggestion. He actually wants to reverse the notion of similarity. So I've got two quotes here. One is from Peirce and one is from Murray Murphy. He says, this sort of association by virtue of which certain kinds of ideas become naturally allied, as crimson and scarlet, is called association by resemblance. So he's saying, right, you've got a sense impression of crimson, you've got a sense impression of scarlet, and conventionally we say, oh, they're like each other. So that's what the similarity is about. The name is not a good one, since it implies that resemblance causes the association, while in point of fact, it is the association which constitutes the resemblance. So he's turned it round. And he's turned it round, of course, because our perceptions are perceptual judgments, and we put everything into a class when we're perceiving something. Murray Murphy makes the same point. The class concept of blue is a general idea which forms a connection among sensations, but the general idea does not produce those sensations. Rather, it is an idea of the sensations which the mind groups together. And this is the line that's important. It is the fact that the mind connects these ideas which makes them similar, in other words, a perceptual judgment, not their similarity, which leads the mind to connect them. So we've got a reversal of similarity, and that is why the icon is monadic. It's not a dyadic relationship between two things, it is actually monadic. So just to summarize this bit of the presentation, an icon is an indeterminate abductive guess at reality. It's an object of thought which awaits further determination. It's a first, it's a vague, it's also monadic. It is formed by the mind spontaneously classifying its sense data on the basis of similarity. It is not, therefore, a dyadic similarity, two betweens there, between two known identities. So that's kind of why the icon is in the classification of signs. Now, the question is then, how do we get from the icon to the symbol? In Peirce's classification of signs, what we've got here is a dynamic model where we go from our very, very first glimmerings of there's something out there, a quali sign, right the way through eventually to the point where we've got an argument where actually we not only know something, but we know why we know something. So this is a dynamic model. It's not a kind of dead classification of sign types. It's actually a model of how you get to meaning. And particularly, we need to understand how you get from the icon to the symbol. So again, this is where Hegel comes in. You've got to begin with an icon. It's a first. It's an indeterminate guess at reality, requiring further determination. Then the index comes along, the next level, which is secondness. And it's the index which delivers those determinations. It says, it's not that thing, it's that sort of thing. It's one of those, it's not one of those. It does this, it doesn't do that. It creates all the connections with the world. But in doing that, it makes it more determined. It goes from indeterminacy down to determinacy. Now, the problem is, it's still, even when it's done that, it's not a genuine sign as far as Peirce is concerned. It's still what he calls a degenerate sign. And you only get to a proper sign when you get to the symbol, which is thirdness. And what the symbol does is creates a new identity in the world. Now, this is challenging and controversial. The interpretant, he's called it an interpretant because it's not an interpretation. It's not an interpreter. It's actually something which is a new identity in the world, which is equivalent to the one that we've had up to this point. And he says that this new identity in the world is created by sublation, which is the Hegelian and German word aufheben. Apologies for my German. Now, aufheben is an interesting word. It means abolish, preserve, and lift up. And what he's saying is, we've got this icon with its indices. We abolish that, but we preserve it at the same time, and then we raise it up to be a symbol. And when we do that, something really interesting happens. The thing turns round, because no longer have we got the icon X with its associations A, B, and C. We've got A, B, and C becoming signs of X, or inclusions of X. We're getting very close to Leibniz at this point. They become inclusions of X. And that is why the symbol becomes a genuine sign, a simplifier of reality. And it's why Hoffman is actually right that signs are about simplifying reality, because when we see a bunch of roses, we know it's a sign of love. We don't have to think about it. We just know that this thing, physical thing out there, is a sign of love. And that forms a relational web in the world. It's what biosemiotics talks a lot about, because actually all these indices have created a web of connections, a web of relationships in the world. So that's how we get from icons to symbols. And if Vladimir is still listening to this online, this is how brands work. This is what a brand is. This is how you get from an icon to a symbol. I spent most of my career doing commercial work, and applying this to branding problems is fascinating, because actually lots of marketing companies have got a symbol, but that symbol hasn't actually been created in this way. It's just a name with a product. It hasn't gone through iconicity, it hasn't gone through indexicality, and it certainly hasn't been sublated, and they're spending millions and millions of pounds trying to make this thing work. It's just a name and a product, an association, not a symbol. So Peirce is really good on marketing. So, brilliant, good. Now, let's just go back to Hegel. Now, this is a quote by Michael Inwood, who's a Hegelian scholar, talking about the business of mediation. And it's just strikingly similar. Thus, mediation and immediacy form not a this is in terms of Hegel. Thus, mediation and immediacy form not a dyadic opposition, but a triad. You start with one, bare but still relative immediacy. Then you get mediation, and then you get mediated immediacy, in which an entity's mediation is taken up into it, which is the sublation. This pattern is repeated. The mediated immediacy that concludes one triad is the bare immediacy that opens the next, semiosis. So what you've got here is exactly the same thing that I've been talking about. The bare immediacy is the icon, the mediation is the indices, and the mediated immediacy is the symbol. And that process goes on, and then you see a symbol with iconicity. So it's that sort of thing I've seen before somewhere. So you start the spiral again, and on and on and on you go. So semiosis is not the passing of signs from one person to another. It's actually the attachment of iconicity to an existing symbol, and that starts the whole process again. This is a quote about Hegel. It's a perfect description of what Peirce is up to with the triadic sign. So all of this leads to a situation where if the essence starts off as a mediating entity between reality and the mind, you end up with this thing in the middle, which is a semiotic reality, which is a symbolic reality. And if you read Peirce, he uses some really weird words to describe symbols. He talks about welding. Well, what's that got to do with social constructivism or messaging or whatever, or interpretation? No, it's welding, because actually what you've got is a bit of the world and a bit of the mind, and they're coming together to fuse something in the middle. He talks about symbols as having a mixed nature. Now, if you go back to Hegel, you find words like amalgam, fusion, alloy. There's all sorts of mixing words being used by Hegel and Peirce, and actually, in my book, I talk about Vygotsky. Vygotsky endlessly talks about amalgams. He's using the same Hegelian model. And you can see this kind of idea of the things merging in the middle, in a mixture which is symbolic, in the fact that Peirce describes himself as an objective idealist. Well, you can see what he's done here. He's rammed two things together, which are usually seen as completely kind of opposite to each other. He's actually taking idealism and objectivism and putting them together. And he kind of defines himself as an objective idealist because he sees Hegel as an absolute idealist, where it's all in the mind, it's all a matter of logic. He also talks, I love this phrase, he also talks about concrete reasonableness, which again is that idea of the two things fused together. And surprise, surprise, this is where Steinfeld's natural propositions come from. I find reading Steinfeld quite interesting. I agree with almost everything he says, but he gets there in the wrong way. He comes from the top down using diagrams. I'd rather come up from the bottom using icons. But actually his idea of natural propositions is again the ramming together of these two things which are usually set apart. And Deely's objects are exactly the same. He makes that distinction between objects which are kind of made by the mind in combination with the world, and things which are just sort of out there. So his objects, his supra-subjective reality of objects has that same sort of status. And all of this is really interesting because it starts to have a huge impact on how we think about symbols, because actually we're starting to have here a way of thinking about symbols which doesn't involve interpretation. It's involved in dialecticism rather than interpretation. And it means, following Hegel, that for Peirce, clouds are symbols, mountains are symbols, tables, chairs, the idea of giving, the idea of bravery, the offside rule in football, they're all symbols. And so suddenly we've collapsed dualism. We haven't got a world out there of mountains and tables and chairs and a kind of mental world of the offside rule in football. Everything is on a similar playing field. Now, that might sound scary. It might sound that we're going to start to treat all of our social conventions as though they're like mountains. No, actually, it's the other way around. What it means is mountains have come to life. They've actually started to behave like symbols, and they have meanings, which is obviously how they work in lots of cultures. And they have that meaning because actually all of these objects are actually objects of thought. They're sublated objects of thought. So Peirce's symbols are not restricted to kind of culture or convention. And interestingly, and maybe challengingly, it means that potentially there's a non-interpretive basis for the unwelt. And when I read biosemioticians, I find I struggle with the idea that it's all about interpretation. I know that Hofmeyr sort of sees cells as interpreting the world, and he applies that. Sternfeld, in a paper in the 1990s, was talking about Hofmeyr's way of thinking about the world in terms of cells interpreting reality. And he says, it is as if the split between subject and object is removed from its problematic place in mind and body and projected into the world, which is now given subject as well as object qualities. But is this way of coping with dualism, is this a way of coping with dualism, or is it rather, in the utmost consequence, a way of spreading it romantically over the whole universe? And I think he's right. What the danger is, if we think about the unworld being created through interpretation, we end up with kind of duality right the way through the system, rather than actually being constructed dialectically. So just a couple of quotes from Peirce on symbols, because it's an interesting and different way of thinking about symbols. Many philosophers say they are mere symbols. Take away the word mere, and this is true. They are symbols, and symbols being the only things in the universe that have any importance, the word mere is a great impertinence. In short, wherever there are thoughts, there is thirdness. And last night I found another quote from him where he says, I confess I wonder how any philosophers can say, oh, thirdness merely exists in thought. So again, he's arguing that symbols are real and that they are the world. Which leads us to an interesting question. How would Peirce actually kind of account for social conventions, for symbols, for things that actually we kind of, in the 20th century, when we've got this kind of huge sense of social constructivism, how would Peirce account for the idea of giving? Well, let's just take you through that. Let's try and account for the concept of giving. A child observes several examples of objects being passed between different people. He or she notes a similarity between some of these actions through a perceptual judgment, and an icon is formed, and that is a guess at an identity in the world. Certain indices become attached to that developing icon, so the child notices that quite often they're wrapped in ribbons, they've got wrapping paper, they're given at parties, people say thank you when they get them. Lots of indices which connect kind of giving with the world are attached to that icon. Over time, the symbol of giving is sublated with rules as to what constitutes an act of giving and what does not. So the symbol is created with a whole set of inclusions and exclusions. So if a child gives something and doesn't wrap it up or throws it at the other child, it's not giving, it's something else. So a whole set of rules are included in the concept of giving because it's a sublated object of thought. So the cultural symbol is created, but it's generated by an individual. It's not generated by lots of people sharing the same idea. What they've done, they've just observed cultural activities and use those as building blocks. So this would be kind of Peirce's way of understanding some of those social conventions. The same would be the same thing would happen with the offside rule in football. So just to finish off, two last charts. Let's go back to the interface theory of perception. Hoffman is both right and wrong. Humans do use an interface theory of perception, but it comprises genuine signs, symbols, not icons. He sees them as these things that sit on a desktop, but actually it's symbols that are the genuine signs, and symbols are the simplifiers that hide the complexity of the world. So he's both right and wrong. And he argues in his paper that symbols are non-veridical and yet not illusory. Well, that's exactly what a symbol is, because it tells us what love is without being veridical in any sense. But these things are not just things on a desktop. They're formed in partnership with the world. They're constantly being revised by secondness. And they are pragmatic in character. Yogi and Brian talk about ITP weds perception to pragmatism. I'd agree with that, but actually it's because symbols wed perception to pragmatism. In fact, there's a kind of 6-lane motorway between Peirce's concept of the symbol and pragmatism. The two things are virtually identical. And then finally, revisiting the unworld. Yes, humans and other animals do live in their own unworld, but each individual builds their own unworld through their own experience by creating their own perceptual icons. The icon, the unwelt can be established on a non-interpretive basis, I would argue. Different individuals and generations develop their own symbols or variations of symbols. So cultural diachrony is ensured over time. Vygotsky is particularly good on this. He's a philosopher of child learning and explains how children get different concepts over time. The unwelt is subjective, I put that in inverted commas, but there's no corresponding notion of objective. Everything is a mediated synthetic reality. And of course, because our cultural activities and our physical spaces are shared, our signs form a web of meaning, so our unwelt and overlap. And that's my lot. Donald?
You said I liked it. I loved it.
Good.
I want you to explain to us briefly. The interpretant is a new identity in the world as a sublation.
Yeah.
The interpretant and sublation are working similarly. Why do you think that the book is not interpretive? Because if sublation is happening in an organism and it's testing it against the world, which where the realism is going to come from, why not use the word interpretation simply to mean the generation of an interpretant, which I've always understood by saying?
Yeah.
What's the difference?
I think it's because it's not, the animal or the human is not looking at something in the world and then interpreting it. What it's doing is taking something and turning it upside down. So it's a different process. Not Peirce's, no. Peirce does use the word interpretation, but I don't think he means by it what we mean it in the 20th century. Yeah. 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 No, they're sublated, I would argue. Yeah. But I think Peirce is arguing against this mirror model of the world that we've had these sense impressions as though they're on the mirror of the mind, the kind of whole Rorty idea of the glassy essence. And we look at these things and then we interpret them. And I think what Peirce is saying is you've got to get rid of the mirror. We see these things directly, but actually they evolve and then they sublate. And so they turn upside down. So he doesn't, I think, believe in interpretation in the way that sort of Locke and Hume and most of the 20th century would assume it works. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Great. And I think that we really, in biosemiotics, really do not talk enough about the connection to Hegel. It's important to keep in mind that Peirce's reading of Hegel was in his later stages after he was done with Kant. My question is regarding the concept of essence. So I take essence in Hegel to mean the set of properties that allows us to individuate, or that individuate the object.
Yep.
And I think the parallel works with the icon, but I don't find Peirce making an ontological claim to the icon insofar as the icon itself is not a representation of the properties of the object. Of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
So with that in mind, one of the weird things that happen is that the object in Peirce does allow for abstract objects and really strange mereological constructions.
Yeah.
And if we take the icon to be an ontological claim, how do we deal with those strange mereologies that exist in Peirce?
Because they're still just guesses. They might turn out to be not real, but they're just guesses. I'm trying to think of a recent example where, I don't know, I'm walking down the streets in Rotterdam, you see something and you think it's like something, and it turns out to be not like that. But it's just a guess. It has no ontological status. It is just a guess. I think that's the answer.
But I also wonder how to understand the conventionality of symbols, which we think that the conventionality defining symbols. The second that since in your presentation you directly go to the human semiosis, so how to understand the wheels of animals according to your theory? It seems that we normally do not think that there is a symbolic capacity from animals.
Right. I think animals do what humans do. They posit an essence. They see a tiger, they think, oh, it's one of those. So I think that they probably don't get to the point where we sublate and where we actually create a symbol, but they certainly have perceptual judgments, and they certainly classify things as things that they should either avoid or look after. And I think even plants do the same. I think plants know that there's one sort of sunlight that's really good and one sort of sunlight that's not really very good, and so they go towards the one that's really good. So I think plants and animals are doing perceptual judgments. I'm not so sure that they're doing symbols.
That's a judgment symbolic or identical.
It's neither. It's iconic. It's just saying, I think it's one of those. It's just one of those, but it's not actually saying what something is.
These two questions, and then we need to move on.
Okay.
Please keep them short. Yeah.
Yeah, you were first.
I love it. Many questions. One question is, how do you understand the psychological concept of resistance? So then somehow it stopped the process. Is there some idea about that? Because, like the example, walking Rotterdam, that could be a welcoming endeavor.
Yeah. I think that's what secondness does. Secondness is coming along, and sometimes Peirce talks about secondness as kind of poking you in the back of the head with a ladder. Sometimes it really hits you around the face and says, no, it's not like that. So there is resistance in the world, and resistance is what determines the indeterminate icon. And he uses the word bestimmen, which Short is particularly good on. He says bestimmen means determination in the sense that the beach limits the lake or the sea. It's actually a limitation. It's not, determination doesn't mean causation, it means limitation. And so secondness, I think, is the resistance of the world, saying, no, you're wrong, actually, guys, it's this, it's not that. Yeah. Right. 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 Yeah, I don't know enough about Right. Yeah, I don't know enough about psychology to know how that really works, but I think Peirce would argue it's coming from the world all the time. Yeah.
And I also have some kind of hesitations how to interpret what you said in biosemiotic framework, because, for instance, you said that all these symbols are genuine signs, but I'm not sure if this is like overall agreed among person's scholarship. So I guess my question would be, what is your opinion on the non-reduction theorem and by Robert Birch?
I don't know it. Sorry, I'm really sorry.
Can only be generated from symbols like that. The phonetic relations are
Right.
And this is, maybe.
Right. No, I think I don't agree with him. But what happens is once we've developed symbols, we then perceive them iconically. So actually, when I see a table, I think, oh, it's like the other tables I've seen in the world. So yes, you're off again on the spiral of semiosis. But to begin with, when you, as a 2-year-old, you're learning what a table is, you haven't formed a symbol yet. So there's an initial process where the symbol is created, and then of course you do see everything that's symbolic in the world through iconicity. So yeah, I ought to read the paper or the book.
All right. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
I'm sure there are many questions that are residual.